Nathan always loved my peach cobbler. That's why I made it that night. His favorite, just like when he was little. But as he took the first bite, I slid a folder across the table and quietly pressed play. The footage showed his wife in my room flipping through my password notebook like it was hers. His face turned pale. "You were spying on us," he stammered. I looked at him and said I was protecting myself. Something I should have done sooner. "Hi, I'm Eleanor Bryce. I'm 68, a retired financial advisor, and for most of my life I believed love meant giving everything and asking for nothing in return. But this is the story of the moment I stopped shrinking, started choosing myself, and rewrote my life one quiet decision at a time." They say betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from those you love most. I never believed that. Until the morning I found a legal notice shoved between the coupons and grocery flyers in my mailbox. It was a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were always my quiet day. No church group, no errands. Just me, my porch, and my morning tea with a slice of lemon. I had just sat down when I saw the envelope. Cream-colored stiff paper. My name printed too formally. Eleanor M. Bryce. No return address, only a law firm's name stamped in the corner I didn't recognize. I opened it, standing right there on the porch, the humidity clinging to my skin. My eyes scanned the first line, then the second, and I felt the blood rush from my face. "This is to inform you that you are no longer authorized to enter or reside at the property located at 217 Bayleaf Court." I had to read it again. That was my house. Or it had been. The house I'd paid off with 35 years of steady, unglamorous work. The house where Howard and I brought Nathan home from the hospital wrapped in a yellow crocheted blanket from my mother. The house where we planted lavender and watched it take over the yard one spring like it had plans of its own. That house. I gripped the railing, suddenly aware of how shaky my hands were. My tea sat untouched, steam curling up like a ghost. I felt something tighten in my chest, not just hurt, not quite anger, a kind of hollowness, like the floor under my life had shifted, but nobody had warned me. Inside, everything felt off. The walls looked the same, the ticking of the grandfather clock still filled the room, but something had broken. I held the letter like it might burn me and sat down at the kitchen table. The same table Nathan used to color on, pressing his crayons so hard they left dents in the wood. I picked up my phone. Called Nathan. Voicemail. Tried again. And again. No answer. It wasn't unusual for him to be busy. He worked in finance, had 2 kids, a modern wife who always seemed just slightly tired of my presence. But 3 days with no response. That wasn't just busy. That was deliberate. When he finally picked up on the 4th day, I felt a brief surge of hope. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe a miscommunication. "Nathan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I got a letter from a lawyer about the house." Silence. Then flatly, like I'd asked about the weather. "Yeah, I had them send that. You had them. Nathan, I don't understand. Why would you do that?" "That's my—" He cut me off. "Mom, let's not do this. You did what you were supposed to do. You raised me. But I don't owe you anything. I don't owe you anything." He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply dismissed me. Like a bill he didn't feel obligated to pay. I sat there long after the call ended, the words echoing in my ears. The boy I'd once sung to sleep when he had fevers, who begged me to read The Velveteen Rabbit one more time, had just told me I was a duty fulfilled. A box checked. And now I was no longer part of the equation. I think I aged 5 years that afternoon. I went into my bedroom where I kept my old files. The cedar cabinet against the far wall. It still smelled faintly of lavender and lemon polish. Top drawer left side under my high school diploma, and a folder of Nathan's report cards was the will. Cream-colored paper folded with care. 8 years ago, when I started talking about retiring, I'd visited a lawyer downtown and drafted it. I remember the appointment clearly. I was still in my Navy work blazer, feeling proud but also a little scared. I had worked for decades as a financial advisor. I'd helped other people manage their money plan for their future. But it's different when it's your own life. Your own son. Back then, I never questioned who I'd leave things to. Nathan was my only child. Of course, everything would go to him. The lake cabin Howard loved, the savings account I'd quietly built, even the antique sapphire pendant from my Aunt Virginia that I only wore on Christmas. I wrote him into every section. Reading it again now, my heart sank. I had written that will with love, with trust. I had believed that he would treasure the life I built, not just materially, but emotionally, that he would honor what it meant, that he would remember what it cost. But now I wondered if he had ever seen it that way at all. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the paper. It felt heavy in my hands. A love letter to a version of my son that maybe never truly existed. The kind of document you write thinking you're building legacy, when in fact you might just be handing over your future to someone who sees it as a transaction. I started thinking back, little things, moments I'd brushed off, like how Nathan never visited on birthdays anymore, only sent gift cards, or how his wife Delaney would always make sure I stayed in the guest suite instead of bothering the kids during holidays, or how Nathan had started talking more about streamlining assets and simplifying titles anytime I mentioned my finances. I thought I was being loved. Maybe I was just being managed. I stood and walked to the closet, pulling out an old photo album. There he was. Nathan at 6 years old, holding a paper star he made for Father's Day, because Howard had just passed, and the teacher said he could give it to me instead. The corners of his smile always turned up more on one side, just like his dad. I remember he had cried that day, asked if he could sleep in my bed again just this once. And I had let him. Every time. The boy I raised had grown into a man who now saw me as something to exclude, a complication. I pressed the album to my chest, then set it down and returned to the table. I opened the will again, and I did something I never thought I'd do. I questioned my own love, not because it wasn't real, but because maybe it had been given without boundaries. Maybe I had handed over too much. My trust, my security, my silence, without asking myself if it was safe to do so. I didn't cry that night. Not yet. But I did leave the will out on the table next to the legal letter. 2 pieces of paper. One written by a mother with nothing but love. The other sent by a son with nothing but distance. And for the first time in 68 years, I looked at both and realized maybe loving someone doesn't mean leaving yourself behind. Maybe it never should have. There's a kind of love that doesn't shout, that doesn't ask for medals or parades. It's the kind that folds laundry at midnight, clips grocery coupons by the glow of a stove light, and remembers every parent-teacher meeting, even when the car barely had gas. That was my love. The quiet kind. The kind I poured into raising Nathan. After Howard passed suddenly, a heart attack that came out of nowhere when Nathan was barely 7, I had no time to grieve in peace. Bills didn't care that I was a widow. My son still needed lunch money and warm winter coats. So I went back to work 3 weeks after the funeral. Mornings I wore navy slacks and a blazer, smiled behind a teller's desk at Magnolia Bank, counting other people's fortunes with a politeness I barely felt. Evenings I taught financial literacy at the community center 2 nights a week. It didn't pay much, but it covered what the bank job didn't. And teaching helped me remember I still had something to offer. I got up at 5, made breakfast, packed lunches, ironed shirts, checked homework, paid bills, and fell asleep on the couch more nights than I care to admit. Not once did I think of it as a sacrifice. It was just being a mother. I had suitors over the years, gentle, respectful men who brought flowers or offered to fix leaky faucets. But I always smiled and said thank you, then sent them kindly on their way. My focus was Nathan. He was my beginning, middle, and end. I told him once when he was 13 and feeling angry at the world for not having a dad like the other boys, "Son, you may not have everything, but you'll have every piece of me." And I meant it. He was a brilliant child, curious, intense, always asking questions that surprised me. Once at age 9, he asked, "Why don't we ever go on vacations like the other kids?" I told him the truth. "Because right now we're building something more lasting than a weekend trip. We're building your future." He didn't understand then. I hoped one day he would, when Nathan got into college. On scholarship. I cried in the parking lot after dropping him off, not because I was sad, but because I had done it. I had kept my promise. He graduated top of his class in finance and started a promising career as a portfolio strategist in Charlotte. I remember him calling to tell me about his first promotion. "They're putting me in charge of a whole client segment, Mom." I'm finally on the map. I was proud, genuinely proud. Around the time Nathan was building his life, I was winding down mine. Or so I thought. I had worked long enough to earn a modest pension and had saved carefully. I always lived below my means, never upgraded my car just because the neighbors did, and I made peace with hand-me-down furniture and grocery store brands. My idea of luxury was a Sunday newspaper and a cup of real vanilla coffee creamer. I had plans for retirement, quiet, modest dreams. I wanted to take a solo road trip down the coast from Savannah to New Orleans, stopping in little antique towns. I even bookmarked a pottery class at the Community Arts Center. For years, I had clipped the brochure and pinned it on my fridge with a magnet shaped like a pear. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It happened at the grocery store. A wet tile near the dairy section. No sign, no warning. My foot slipped out from under me and I went down hard. The pain was instant and unforgiving. I fractured my right kneecap and damaged some ligaments. Recovery was long and slow, the kind that humbles you. Suddenly, the stairs in my house felt like mountains. Carrying laundry or even bending down to tie my shoes became a struggle. My independence, the thing I held onto so tightly, started to erode bit by bit. At first, I refused help. I limped around stubborn as ever, telling myself it would pass. But even simple tasks became exhausting. I burned meals, forgot to take out the trash, and once left the back door open all night without realizing. It was Nathan who brought up the idea. He called one afternoon while I was trying to make tea with trembling hands. "Mom," he said, "Delaney and I were talking. We built a small guest suite in the backyard. It's just sitting there. Why don't you move in? It's a 2-bedroom with a ramp and everything. You wouldn't have to worry about stairs. Ruby and Eli would love seeing you more." I hesitated. My first instinct was to say no. I didn't want to be a burden. I had spent my whole life standing on my own feet, even when they were unsteady. But then he said something that softened me. "It's your home too, Mom. We want you close." I took a deep breath, looked out the kitchen window at the lavender bush Howard planted years ago, and whispered to myself, "At least he still cares." So I said yes. The transition was simple enough. Nathan and Delaney arranged for movers. I packed up what I needed. Mostly books, photo albums, my favorite kettle, and a few pieces of furniture that held sentimental value. I left behind the formal dining set and most of the knickknacks. I told myself it was a new chapter, a smaller one, but one filled with family. The guest suite was cozy. Pale yellow walls, wide windows, and a small kitchenette. They'd even stocked the fridge before I arrived. Ruby drew me a picture that said, "Welcome Nana Ellie" in purple crayon. Eli gave me a sticky high five and said I smelled like cookies. It felt warm, familiar. Like maybe, just maybe, I could finally rest. Maybe all those years of doing and giving and holding everything together had earned me this little house behind my son's big one. In those first few weeks, I even allowed myself to dream again. I took long naps, read mystery novels I had never gotten around to, and joined a seniors book club at the local library. I wasn't the Eleanor who taught budgets and balanced checkbooks anymore. I was just Nana Ellie, retired home at last. Looking back now, I realize how badly I wanted to believe that Nathan's offer came from love, that this move wasn't about convenience or obligation, that he truly wanted me close, not because I needed help, but because I mattered. I clung to that hope like a life raft. I told myself he wouldn't offer if he didn't care. I repeated it in the shower when my joints ached. I told myself it again the first time I walked into the main house without knocking and saw Delaney's tight smile. Even when the warmth began to fade, I reminded myself, at least he still wants me here. I didn't know then what was coming. I didn't know how thin the line was between welcome and tolerated. I didn't know how quickly love could curdle into something else. But I would learn, and that tiny house in the backyard would become something very different than a place of rest. It would become a stage for the quiet unraveling of everything I thought was true. At first, it was sweet, almost too sweet in hindsight, the kind of sweetness that makes you wonder if it's masking something bitter underneath. I moved into the guest suite behind Nathan and Delaney's house in early spring. The azaleas were blooming in their yard, and Ruby had painted me a welcome sign with glitter that never quite dried. Eli brought me a rock from the playground, proudly announcing, "It's magic." I laughed and told him I'd keep it forever. Those first few weeks felt like a reward I never expected. I helped Delaney with the kids in the mornings, packed lunches, brushed tiny curls, located lost shoes. I made dinner some nights, just simple things. Chicken soup when someone was sniffling cornbread when the air turned cool. I'd tidy up the playroom when no one asked fold laundry left in the dryer. It wasn't much, but it made me feel useful, needed. And I liked feeling needed. It gave me a kind of purpose again. Delaney was polite, if not particularly warm. She thanked me here and there, offered coffee, sometimes always looked busy. I didn't mind. I knew how hard it was juggling kids and a household. I told myself, give her grace. She's doing her best. Nathan, when he was home, gave me hugs that were quick but still real. He'd say, "Thanks for keeping the chaos under control." Mom and I'd smile like a teenager being noticed by her crush. It didn't matter that he said it while staring at his phone. It still counted, right? But slowly, the air began to change. The first time I noticed it was subtle. I had baked a lemon loaf and brought it over to the main house after lunch. I didn't knock. I never had to before. I just let myself in like family does. But that day I stepped inside and found Delaney in the kitchen, visibly startled. She glanced up from her laptop and quickly shut it. "Oh, hi," she said, her voice high and tight. "I didn't hear you come in." "I brought cake," I said, holding it out like a peace offering. She took it, smiled a little too quickly. "That's nice. Thank you." I waited for her to offer a plate to sit and have a slice with me like she had the week before, but she didn't. She turned back to her laptop and I stood there awkward, holding the empty dish. From that day on, I started knocking. At first it was just to be courteous, but then it became necessary, because when I forgot, I'd find locked doors. Delaney would answer looking like I'd interrupted something important, even if she was just folding socks. "Next time, just text me first," she said once. I nodded, but something inside me deflated. Then came the missing thank yous. Not all at once, just little omissions. I'd fold a pile of laundry and it would be quietly collected without a word. I'd leave dinner on the counter. Delaney's favorite baked ziti. And it would be eaten, but no one would mention it. I began to feel invisible. Even the kids noticed something was different. Ruby, once bubbly and attached to my side, started hesitating before running up to hug me. Eli still brought me his magic rocks, but now he looked over his shoulder first as if checking for permission. The warmth didn't disappear overnight. It thinned out like soup stretched too far with water. You could still taste what it used to be, but it no longer filled you. Still, I stayed quiet. I convinced myself it was a phase. Maybe they were stressed. Maybe I was being overly sensitive. I told myself, don't make a fuss. You're lucky to be here. Then came the dinner. It was a Sunday. Nathan grilled in the backyard. The kids were laughing, chasing each other between the tomato plants. I brought over coleslaw and sweet tea and watched Nathan flip burgers like he used to at summer cookouts when he was in high school. For a moment, it felt like old times. We sat on the patio, sun setting soft and gold behind the trees. Delaney poured wine. Nathan cracked a joke. I laughed genuinely. It was the first time in weeks I felt like part of the family again. After dinner, I went inside to help with the dishes. As I passed through the hallway near the pantry, I heard voices. Low, tense. Delaney's. She's not dying in that guest house. That's not the plan. I froze. Nathan replied quieter. Delaney? No. I agreed to help. But this isn't permanent. She needs to know that. My chest tightened. I backed up slowly, careful not to make a sound. My hand clutched the empty tea pitcher like it might steady me. I stood in the laundry room for a minute, just breathing. The smell of fabric softener filled the air, thick and too sweet. I didn't cry. Not yet. I smoothed my shirt, forced a smile, and walked back out to the patio like nothing had happened. Nathan asked if I wanted dessert. I shook my head. That night back in my little guest suite, I sat in the dark, watching the lights go off one by one in the main house. I could still hear the faint laughter of the kids from their upstairs window. I thought about all the moments I'd stepped in to help, all the ways I tried to be less of a burden, more of a blessing. And I thought about Delaney's words, not whispered in anger, not shouted in frustration, spoken like a plan. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if they had been waiting for me to break, wondering if they had a timeline, an end game, a quiet exit strategy I was never meant to hear. I didn't sleep that night. The warmth that once wrapped around me like a soft shawl had fallen away, and in its place was something cold, familiar almost, the kind of cold I hadn't felt since the night I lost Howard. But this time the grief wasn't from losing a husband. It was from realizing I might be losing my son. It's a strange thing. How a home, even a small one meant to feel cozy and safe, can begin to feel like a trap. Like the walls are listening. Like the air no longer belongs to you. It started with the thermostat. One morning I woke up shivering. My joints ached. The kind of ache that creeps in when you've had a knee injury when you're not as young as you once were. I reached for the thermostat in the hallway of my guest suite and tried to nudge it up a few degrees. The screen blinked red. Locked by admin. I stared at it, blinking. I didn't know thermostats could even be locked. It wasn't just set to a temperature. It was disabled. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and waited until I saw Nathan on his way to the garage that afternoon. "Sweetheart?" I said casually. "Do you know why the thermostat's locked? I can't adjust it." He barely looked up from his phone. "Oh yeah, we had to lock it down. The kids were messing with it." I smiled, but something in me twisted. "But the kids don't come into my unit." He shrugged. "Just easier this way. Easier for whom I let it go, or at least pretended to." But I couldn't shake the feeling. That coldness wasn't just physical. It was creeping into everything now. Next came the internet. I had a quiet routine every evening, a cup of herbal tea, soft music, and a video call with my friend June from church. We'd known each other since Nathan was in middle school. We talked about recipes, news, whatever book we were both reading. But one Tuesday night, the screen froze mid-sentence. I refreshed, waited, nothing. My laptop showed no network available. Strange. I tried my phone. Same thing. The next morning, I asked Delaney casually if there had been a service outage. She looked up from her tablet and said, "Oh, I think Nathan had the guest network disabled. Too many devices were slowing things down." I nodded slowly. "Would it be all right if I got it turned back on?" She didn't look up. "He'll take care of it." But he didn't. Days passed. I asked again. Nathan smiled and said, "We're just simplifying things." You probably don't need it for much, right? It wasn't just the inconvenience. It was the tone. Like I was being slowly phased out one small liberty at a time. And then came the medicine. I had a strict routine. Every Sunday I laid out my pills for the week. Calcium blood pressure, the little blue one for cholesterol. I kept everything in the top drawer of my bathroom vanity labeled and organized. But one morning I opened the drawer and paused. The bottle of lisinopril, my blood pressure meds, wasn't the brand I always used. The color of the pills was different. The label looked almost like the original, but the pharmacy listed wasn't the one I always filled from. I checked my records. I hadn't asked for a refill yet, and I certainly hadn't changed pharmacies. A cold pit formed in my stomach. I examined the packaging closely. It was generic, possibly fine, but I hadn't approved the change. I hadn't been told. Someone had replaced it quietly. I didn't know when. I didn't know why. I asked Nathan about it that afternoon. I didn't accuse. I just asked. His answer: "It's just a glitch. Maybe they ran out of your usual brand." "It's the same thing, Mom." I looked at him carefully. He didn't meet my eyes. Something inside me clicked. That was the moment when the vague unease, the kind I'd tried to silence, became something sharper, a throb of alarm. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back just a little and I caught a glimpse of something I wasn't supposed to see. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. One Friday, I stepped out early to water the rosemary by the porch. As I walked past the side of the house, I heard voices near the garage. I slowed instinctively. The side door was cracked open, and through it I saw Nathan standing with a man I didn't recognize, well-dressed, holding a tablet, sunglasses perched in his hair. They didn't see me. I stood just behind the hydrangeas hidden by the early spring blooms. The man tapped something on his screen and said, "If we push the title change before Q4, you'll have less tax liability. She won't even notice." Nathan nodded. "Right. Let's do it. Get the documents ready. I'll get her to sign something by the end of the month." I went still. Title change. Before Q4. She won't even notice I didn't breathe. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. But the meaning was clear. They were planning something, and whatever it was, I was the obstacle, not the recipient. I backed away, careful not to rustle the bushes, and returned to my suite. My legs felt hollow. My breath came in shallow bursts. I sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to replay the words. They sounded professional, casual, like this was just business. But it wasn't. It was my home, my life, and they were making plans to take it without even telling me. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening for sounds in the hallway. Every creak of the floor made me jump. I thought about the thermostat, the internet, the medicine. Each one had been explained away. Small, unimportant things. Until they weren't. Now I saw the pattern. This wasn't just distance or disinterest. This was control. Quiet, precise control. And for the first time I wondered if I was safe here. Not just emotionally, but truly physically safe. And the scariest part wasn't what they had done. It was what they might be willing to do next. Trust doesn't shatter with a bang. It doesn't announce itself with screams or slammed doors. It disappears quietly, like fog burned off by morning sun. And by the time you realize it's gone, so much else has gone with it. After overhearing Nathan's conversation in the garage, I began to notice everything. Every pause in a sentence. Every door that closed too softly. Every new thing that felt like an old plan. I didn't confront them. Not yet. That wasn't my way. I've never been one for dramatics. But I did begin checking. Quietly. Carefully. Like a woman retracing her own steps after realizing she might have dropped something precious. I pulled out my file box one evening after they thought I was asleep. The one with my estate papers, health records, financial backups. Stuff I hadn't touched since I first moved into the guest suite. I turned on the reading lamp and sat at my little desk, the fan humming in the background like white noise covering the noise in my chest. There it was, my original will. But as I flipped through the folders, I saw something odd. A second copy. Same layout, same paper. But the contents had shifted. Where I had once listed both Nathan and the Georgia Women's Support Foundation, an organization I had quietly supported since Howard passed. Now there was only one name. Nathan, no charity, no conditions, full control. At first I thought maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe I had updated it in a moment of fatigue or confusion. But then I saw the signature. It looked like mine. Elegant cursive curling just the way I'd been taught in Catholic school. But it was perfect. Too perfect. No shakiness, no hesitation. It looked like someone had practiced. Or copied. And I knew right then, I hadn't signed that. I sat back in my chair and felt a wave of cold run through me. It wasn't just the betrayal of what I found. It was the realization that someone had counted on me not finding it, that they'd planned this and in their planning had decided I was no longer someone worth consulting. I wrote it down in my journal that night, not as a rant but as a record. A piece of truth I needed to anchor myself. What hurts is not that they planned around me. It's that they assumed I wouldn't notice. The next morning I ordered a small surveillance camera online. Nothing fancy, just a discreet model shaped like a desk clock. I told myself it was for peace of mind, that if nothing happened, I'd delete the footage and move on. But part of me already knew. When it arrived, I placed it carefully on the shelf near my entryway. It faced the living room, angled just enough to capture the front door and the writing desk where I kept my notebooks. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't change my habits. I waited. 3 days later, I found my answer. I had gone out for groceries just long enough to restock flour and eggs. When I returned, nothing looked out of place. No drawers left open, no signs of disturbance. But that evening after dinner, I reviewed the footage. There she was, Delaney, letting herself in with the emergency key. She walked straight to the desk, no hesitation, and opened the drawer where I kept my small leather-bound notebook. The one I used for passwords account, reminders, notes to myself. She flipped through it, one hand scanning the other, holding her phone. She took pictures, every page. And then she gently placed it back, smoothed the cover like she hadn't touched it, and walked out without a sound. I watched the footage twice. Not in shock, but in something heavier. Something more final. Love is stubborn. It makes you make excuses long after the facts are clear. It keeps whispering. Maybe there's a reason. Maybe she thought you needed help. Maybe she was worried you'd forget. But trust doesn't whisper. It simply leaves. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't storm over to the main house. I didn't even call a friend. I made tea, sat on the sofa, opened my journal, and wrote, "They used to knock. Now they don't. They used to say thank you. Now they don't. They used to care if I was okay. Now they assume I won't know when I'm not." I looked around my little guest house, this small, pretty prison I had convinced myself was love, and realized I was alone. Not because I didn't have family, but because they had already left me. They just forgot to pack their things when they did. And while the part of me that loved Nathan, my son, my only child, still existed, it now lived beside something colder, firmer, the understanding that I couldn't trust him anymore. Not with my home, not with my money, and not with my life. I didn't rush. I didn't storm out or shout or throw things like the women in movies do when they find out they've been betrayed. That's not who I am. Never has been. When I was young and angry, I learned quickly that silence holds more weight than noise. And now, standing at this age with the life I'd built unraveling beneath my feet, I didn't need fury. I needed clarity. So I began quietly gathering truth. It started with a visit to Agnes. She and I had taught budgeting workshops together at the community center years ago, back when our hair was more pepper than salt. She had since retired but still kept her notary license current, mostly for church and close friends. I hadn't seen her in a while, but when she opened the door to her small brick house on Elmwood Lane, she didn't hesitate. "Come in, Ellie," she said without even asking why I'd called. I held out the papers. Both versions of my will. One I remembered signing in my lawyer's office 10 years ago. The other, the perfect forgery with my name, my curl, my date. Impossibly neat. She laid both out on her kitchen table, put on her glasses, and reached for her magnifying glass. Agnes didn't rush either. She took her time. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, the same way I had sat in parent-teacher meetings when Nathan was 10 and had forgotten to turn in a project. The same way I had sat in hospital waiting rooms when Howard was dying. Calm on the outside. Chaos just below. After several long minutes, she exhaled. "This one here," she said, tapping the forged copy with her finger, was traced. I didn't react. Just blinked. "You're sure?" She looked up. "Well, there's pressure indentation under the strokes. See that? It's subtle, but it's there. Someone traced it from a printout or a digital overlay. They knew what they were doing, but not quite well enough." I nodded. I needed to hear that from someone besides myself. She reached across the table and took my hand. "Ellie, I don't know what's going on, but whoever did this, whoever went that far, they weren't guessing. They were counting on you staying quiet. That stayed with me. They were counting on me staying quiet." The next day I called a different lawyer, not the one who'd handled my original will. He had retired to Arizona. I needed someone sharper now. Someone who'd seen what people don't like to talk about. I found Miranda Jensen through a recommendation from the local senior advocacy group. Her specialty, elder financial abuse and estate fraud. When I walked into her office, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman with a mission. She listened. Didn't interrupt. Just took notes, asked clarifying questions, and nodded. When I showed her the documents, she examined them closely. When I handed her the printed screenshots from my hidden camera. Delaney rifling through my notebook. She didn't flinch. "This," she said, "is enough to open a formal investigation. But more importantly, it gives us leverage." I shook my head. "I'm not looking for revenge. I'm looking for protection." She smiled gently. "You're not the first to say that." "And you won't be the last." We made a plan. I began backing up everything I had. Photos, documents, footage, journal entries. I scanned every page I'd kept in that guest house. I organized files by date, labeled them carefully, and uploaded encrypted versions to a cloud folder Miranda had access to. Then I made 3 USB copies. One I mailed to Miranda's office by registered post. One I delivered in person to my banker at Heritage Federal, the only branch still handling what was left of my investments. And the third, I kept that one with me tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Little Women, the one with the worn red spine that sat on my nightstand. No one ever touched my books. All the while I went about my days as if nothing had changed. I still watered the rosemary. I still baked cornbread on Thursdays. I still waved at Ruby from across the yard when she got off the school bus, even when Delaney didn't acknowledge me. But something inside me had shifted. I didn't feel afraid anymore. I didn't even feel angry. That had passed. The grief had dulled. The betrayal had stopped stinging. What I felt now was a kind of cold, deliberate clarity. It was the same clarity I had when I walked into a bank boardroom to explain a client's estate plan. The same calm I carried when I sat beside Howard's hospital bed and made decisions the doctors couldn't. The same stillness I had the day I wrote the check for Nathan's college tuition. Money I could have used to fix the roof or finally visit Oregon like I'd dreamed. This wasn't about money. This was about being erased. And I wasn't going to let that happen. Not quietly, not kindly, not ever again. I spent the entire morning in the kitchen peeling peaches. Not the frozen kind, not the kind from a can. Real peaches. Soft, sun-warmed, just barely overripe, the way Nathan used to like them. The way I used to make them every year when school started and he'd come home with scuffed sneakers and stories about the kids who got in trouble for talking during math. Peach cobbler was always his favorite. That morning I measured the sugar, carefully folded the dough gently, and baked it slow, letting the smell fill every corner of the guest house. Butter and cinnamon, sweet and sharp. I hadn't made this in years. But this wasn't about nostalgia. This was about closure. When they arrived, they were 5 minutes late as usual. Delaney wore that lipstick she only pulled out when she wanted to appear polished, and Nathan gave me a brief hug like he was trying to prove something. "Smells amazing, Mom," he said, slipping into his usual seat. "Peach cobbler," I replied. "Just like old times?" Delaney smiled thinly. "You didn't have to go through all that trouble." I poured sweet tea and sat across from them at the table I'd inherited from my Aunt Marianne, the one with the little scuff on the edge that Nathan made with a toy car when he was 6. We made small talk, Eli's school play, Ruby's new violin teacher, the weather. I let them settle in, let the air grow comfortable. Let them believe everything was fine. Then I stood, and I picked up the manila folder I had set beside me on the counter. "What's that?" Nathan asked, still chewing. "Something I think we need to talk about," I said. I walked to the TV stand and picked up the remote. One click. The screen lit up with a paused frame Delaney standing in my living room flipping through my password notebook. I pressed play. No one spoke. The video was silent. Just her movements, her phone flashing as she photographed page after page, her fingers moving like she'd done it before. Delaney went rigid. That's not what it looks like." I held up a hand. "No need to explain." Nathan's jaw tightened. "You were spying on us." I turned toward him slowly. I was protecting myself. Something I should have done sooner. He looked away. I walked back to the table and laid down the next item, my will. 2 versions. One marked with yellow highlights where names had changed. One with a notarized signature. The other with a signature traced with just enough pressure to leave a dent, but not enough to fool a trained eye. I looked straight at my son. This was not an accident. This wasn't carelessness. This was a plan. A plan to remove me from my own life bit by bit. Delaney opened her mouth. "We were just trying to help," I said softly. "You help by asking. You help by supporting. Not by sneaking. Not by forging. Not by assuming I'm too old, too tired, or too alone to notice." Nathan stood abruptly pacing near the kitchen island. "You always think the worst of us, ever since Dad died. This isn't about Dad," I said. "This is about you, and the choices you made. Quietly, deliberately, repeatedly." I lifted the final item, a small black USB drive. "This contains copies of every document, every recording, every change in the will. Miranda Jensen, my new attorney, has the rest. If I disappear, if I fall down the stairs, if one more pill in my cabinet looks wrong, she goes to the authorities." Delaney's face drained of color. "You're being dramatic. I'm being precise," I replied. Then I exhaled slowly, looked at them both, and said what I had rehearsed in my head 100 times. "As of last week, Nathan, you are no longer named in my will. You will receive nothing from my estate. Not the house, not the accounts, not even the photo albums." His mouth opened, but I raised a finger. "And if either of you approaches me again about finances, documents, or tries to enter my home without permission, Miranda is prepared to file charges, civil and criminal. That includes accessing my accounts, altering paperwork, or even hinting at control over my assets." Silence. Outside I could hear a bird chirping. Ruby's bicycle bell rang in the distance. The normalness of the moment made it all the more surreal. Nathan sat down, visibly shaken. Delaney looked down at her empty plate. The cobbler remained untouched. "You don't mean that," he finally whispered. "You're still my mother." "I'll always be your mother," I said, voice steady. "But being your mother doesn't mean surrendering who I am, or letting you rewrite the story of my life while I'm still living it." Delaney stood first. Her napkin dropped to the floor unnoticed. Nathan lingered. He looked at me, eyes searching for a softness that used to be there, and maybe in another version of our lives it would have been Maybe if he had said sorry. Maybe if he had shown even a flicker of remorse. But he didn't. So I simply said, "Goodbye, Nathan," and watched them walk out the door. This time I didn't feel small. This time I didn't feel broken. I just felt done. Moving out felt less like an ending and more like returning to something I didn't know I'd lost. I didn't pack in haste. Each drawer I opened felt like a conversation with a former version of myself. There were notes I'd written to Nathan when he was in college. Reminders to eat, to sleep, to breathe. A pair of gloves Howard had given me in our second winter together. Faded photographs I hadn't seen in years tucked into the back of a recipe book as if they were waiting patiently for me to come back and find them. And in a way, that's what this move was, coming back to myself. The condo I chose in Brunswick wasn't large, just 2 bedrooms and a narrow kitchen that overlooked the riverbanks. But it had a front porch and light poured through every window, like it had been waiting to touch something gentle. It sat on the edge of the arts district where musicians practiced in open garages, and the used bookstore 2 blocks down still rang up customers with an old brass bell on the counter. When I stepped through the door the first time, keys jingling in my palm, I didn't cry. I smiled. I set down my purse and whispered aloud, "You're home." The first thing I did was strip the walls bare. The paint was an old beige that reminded me of hospital waiting rooms, functional but lifeless. I drove myself to the hardware store and picked out 3 colors, coral sage and sky blue. The young man at the paint counter asked, "Do you need a contractor for this, ma'am?" I shook my head, smiled. "No, I think I need to do this part myself." It wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about decision. For too many years, every choice I made was weighed against someone else's comfort, someone else's opinion. I had compromised in invisible ways. Colors, I didn't love recipes, I didn't want to cook silences, I didn't want to keep. But this was mine. I painted the kitchen coral first. The scent of fresh paint mixed with the citrus candle I'd lit by the window. It reminded me of the summers I used to dream of taking in Key West, but always put off for later. The sage in the living room followed, soft, grounded like the color of new beginnings. The bedroom came last sky blue like peace without permission. I changed the locks the next day. Not because I was scared anymore, but because I wasn't. I called my bank, my insurance company, my utility providers. I updated every name on every account. There were no cosigners now, no second contacts. The woman on the phone asked, "Would you like to add an emergency contact?" I paused, then said, "Yes. Miranda Jensen, she's my attorney." That was it. My name was the only one that mattered again. I unpacked slowly. Every plate had a story. Every book had a memory tucked in its spine. There were things I left behind intentionally. A wool scarf Nathan had given me one Christmas. The one I used to wear, even though it itched. A ceramic bowl Delaney once made in a class and handed me like it was an obligation. I gave that to the thrift store. The rest I curated. This house wouldn't be crowded. Not with things, not with noise, not with guilt. In the mornings I settled into a rhythm. I made a single cup of coffee. Just how I liked it. Strong with a splash of oat milk and a dusting of cinnamon. I carried it out to the porch and sat in the wicker chair that creaked just slightly when I rocked. From there I could see the river curve away into mist. The tide came and went like breath. I started sketching again. I hadn't touched a pencil for art in over 20 years, but my hands remembered. They were slower now, less precise, but more patient. I drew wild daisies first, then sparrows, then the chipped teacup I kept by my bedside. Sometimes I didn't draw anything at all. I just sat. There was a calm I hadn't known I needed, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but arrives in the way light filters through leaves, or how silence hums when no one is waiting for you to speak. On Sundays, I took a walk through the neighborhood farmers market. I bought things I didn't need, bundles of eucalyptus jars of lavender honey, bright red tomatoes with dirt still clinging to their stems. The vendors got to know me by name. One woman, Etta, sold homemade marmalade and always threw in a free jar when she saw me. "You've got one of those gentle faces," she said once. I smiled. It took me a while to grow into it. In the evenings I cooked slowly, not out of duty but delight. Rosemary roasted potatoes, lemon chicken, blackberry cobbler that stained my fingers. I set one plate, poured a glass of wine, and played jazz on the little Bluetooth speaker Agnes had given me for Christmas. Sometimes I lit a candle. Sometimes I just opened the windows and let the salt air carry the meal out into the night. Then I wrote. Not to remember. I had spent too many years writing down grocery lists, reminders for Nathan passwords tucked into books like secrets. Now I wrote to witness my own life. I began each entry with something small and true. The river sounded different today. I didn't check my phone once this afternoon. I bought sunflowers and they made the whole room feel like July. These weren't dramatic epiphanies. They weren't meant for anyone else to read. But they were mine. My thoughts and my voice on my terms. There were moments of sadness still. I'd see a mother and son sharing a bench, laughing over sandwiches, and something in me would flinch. A flicker of memory, a longing that hadn't yet learned to stop hoping. But it passed. The hurt no longer owned me. It had simply become part of the landscape, like a scar on the skin. You don't forget how it got there, but you learn to live above it. I even began thinking about that pottery class again. There was a community center just down the road with flyers taped to its windows and an open studio on Thursday nights. I didn't sign up right away, but one evening I stood at the door, hand on the handle, just breathing, just considering. And that was enough, because I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't shrinking or apologizing or pretending I was fine when I wasn't. I was simply here, alive, choosing. And with every brushstroke of paint, every cup of coffee sipped in solitude, every journal entry scribbled by lamplight, I was reclaiming a life that had always been mine. Even when I'd almost forgotten, I didn't expect the watercolors to heal me. When I signed up for the class, I told the woman at the front desk, I'm not looking to paint a masterpiece. I just want to remember how to hold a brush without trembling. She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. The class met every Tuesday and Thursday at the local arts co-op, a converted warehouse with high ceilings and sun-drenched windows. It smelled like turpentine and lemon oil with old jazz playing softly in the background. Most of the students were older women like me, women with graying hair, gentle hands, and quiet stories folded into their posture. We didn't ask each other's pasts directly, but we spoke through our colors. One woman named Judith painted only in shades of blue, stormy, crashing, relentless. When I complimented her strokes one day, she smiled faintly and said, My son emptied my retirement account last year. I only found out when the bank called. No tears, just paint. Another Rosa painted with trembling hands, mostly flowers with missing petals. She told me in a hushed voice that her daughter hadn't spoken to her since Rosa sold the family home to avoid foreclosure. She said I ruined her legacy, she whispered. I nodded, not because I had the right words, but because I finally understood the kind of ache that lingers beneath well-set smiles. We painted side by side. Not to create art for display, but to express things we didn't always have the language for. I found myself reaching for color again. Dandelion yellow, rose pink, a splash of moss green. My hands grew steadier each week, not because they had healed physically, but because something inside me had. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for the next cut. I wasn't shrinking to make room. I wasn't calculating whether my presence would be too much for someone else to tolerate. I was just there, brush in hand, breathing. Sometimes we talked. Other times we let the silence fill the space like warmth. One Tuesday afternoon, Judith brought in a box of warm scones wrapped in linen. Still figuring out how to bake for one, she said. And we all smiled. Someone brought fresh lavender. Another woman passed around tea in paper cups. It wasn't a therapy session, but it felt like one, because in that room we weren't burdens or complications or footnotes in someone else's life. We were artists, survivors, Women who had trusted too much and lost too much and still showed up, still created, still dared to begin again. After class, I often walked the long way home past the old bakery along the river path. It became a kind of ritual. I'd pause by the weeping willows near the bench overlooking the tide and let the breeze pull at the edges of my scarf. Some days I closed my eyes and listened to the water. Not for guidance, just for company. It was during one of those walks that I bumped into Lily. She lived 2 doors down from my new condo. 7 years old, all freckles and gap teeth and boundless energy. She had once knocked on my door asking if I had any real sugar because her mom was on a health kick again, and the cookies at home tasted like cardboard. I gave her a chocolate chip muffin and told her to keep that secret between us. That day she appeared in front of me on the sidewalk, holding a handful of wildflowers. Daisies, buttercups, and something purple I couldn't quite name. "These are for you," she said, pushing the bouquet into my hand without ceremony. I blinked. "Oh, Lily, what's the occasion?" She shrugged, then smiled wide. "You're like sunshine with glasses." I laughed. Loud and without hesitation. Not a polite chuckle, not a guarded smile. A real laugh, full and rich, that rose from my belly and startled even me. Sunshine with glasses. That evening I placed the flowers in a mason jar and set them in the kitchen window. I kept looking at them between sips of tea, between turning the pages of the book I was reading between breaths. They weren't arranged perfectly. Some stems were already wilting, but they were vibrant, defiant, alive, and so was I. Later that night I pulled out my journal and wrote a sentence I hadn't dared to say until that moment: "I have forgiven him." It surprised me even as I wrote it. Not because he deserved forgiveness. He didn't. But because I no longer wanted to carry the weight of his choices on my shoulders. I had spent too many years bending backward for people who mistook my love for permission. I had loved Nathan deeply. I always would. But love that requires erasure isn't love. It's control. So yes, I forgave him. But I didn't forget. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not about excusing. It's about releasing. It's about saying, "This no longer belongs to me. This pain, this disappointment, this burden. You can carry what you created." And I would carry what I created, a life stitched back together, one gentle act at a time. The next morning I painted sunshine. Not a landscape. Not a literal sun in the sky. Just warmth in layers of yellow and cream and golden ochre. A blur of brightness that spilled across the canvas like a secret finally spoken. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be true. That afternoon, as I sat on the porch with my tea and watched the wind tease the curtains, I realized something simple and profound. I liked myself again. Not just tolerated her, not just coexisted. I liked who I had become, who I was becoming. A woman who could survive heartbreak and still believe in beauty. A woman who could sit in her own silence and not feel afraid. A woman who had found her way not by fighting, but by letting go. The return of self isn't a loud arrival. It's a quiet recognition. A soft welcome back, whispered in the way your shoulders settle. In the way your laughter returns. In the way a little girl's words echo in your heart. And suddenly, finally, you believe them. Sunshine with glasses. Yes, that's who I am now. The morning I signed the final version of my will, the air smelled like lemons. Not the bitter artificial scent from a cleaning product, but real lemons cut fresh and left out in a ceramic bowl by the window. The kind of scent that lingers and lifts. The kind that feels like a beginning, not an ending. My lawyer, Miranda, sat across from me at the small round table in my sunlit kitchen. Her presence had become steady in my life. A woman who didn't speak in platitudes but in clear steps and firm protection. She had guided me through this with a quiet strength I had long forgotten I could lean on. The papers were stacked in front of us, crisp and deliberate. Every page a declaration of clarity. "This is it," Miranda said, tapping her pen gently against the folder. "When you're ready, Eleanor." And I was ready. I picked up the pen. My hand, once shaky in betrayal, moved with calm resolve. I signed my name slowly, without apology. The new will named 2 beneficiaries. The first was the Hearth Project, a nonprofit that supports elderly women who have experienced financial coercion or emotional neglect from their own families. I had read their mission statement on a quiet afternoon sitting on my porch with a cup of hibiscus tea. "We believe every woman deserves a life of dignity no matter her age or story." Their words had felt like mine. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice in the way most people meant it. It was about redirection, about taking what was meant to be stolen and sending it where it could grow into warmth, into shelter, into freedom. The second name on the document was a woman many would have overlooked. Angie. She wasn't a friend in the traditional sense. She had cleaned my home every other Thursday for the past 6 years. Soft-spoken, reliable, always humming something under her breath as she worked. I didn't know much about her life. But I did know one moment that stayed with me. It was months ago, long before I moved. I had apologized for the mess as I always did, and she smiled kindly and said, "Miss Eleanor, stop saying sorry for living in your own home. You still have time to live for you. Just like that. You still have time to live for you." It wasn't a grand statement. It wasn't poetry. But it was real. And it was the first time in years I had considered that I wasn't too late, that maybe my best years hadn't passed me by just because someone else had decided I no longer had value. So I left her something. Not everything, but enough to fix her car, to go back to school if she wanted, to build a little cushion she wouldn't have to clean around. She had reminded me that kindness doesn't need to be loud to be life-changing. Once the papers were signed, Miranda closed the folder and said, "Do you feel okay?" I nodded. I feel final, but not in a sad way. It was like closing the cover on a book I had reread too many times and finally setting it on the shelf, ready to reach for something new. That evening, I sat down at my writing desk with a fresh sheet of stationery. I hadn't written letters in a long while, not even at Christmas. But this one wasn't for the post office. This one was for me. I titled it simply, "To the Woman Who Stayed." I began slowly, not to be eloquent, but to be honest. "You are not what they did to you," I wrote. "You are what you chose after." The words spilled gently like warm tea. I told myself the truth I had longed to hear from someone else, and in doing so I began to believe it in my bones. You are not the version of yourself they wanted you to be. You are the woman who said no more in a room where no one was listening. You walked away without slamming the door, and still they heard the sound of it for weeks. You made peace, not because they asked for forgiveness, but because you chose to stop bleeding for people who only noticed you when you were useful. I paused then, breathing slowly, letting the weight of the words rest on my chest like a blanket. I folded the letter not to mail, but to keep, to return, to remember. The next morning, I tucked it into the back of my journal and placed it in my bedside drawer beside the sketchbook where I had drawn the first wild daisy. The flowers still looked a little uneven, but now it made me smile. Somewhere in town, a new family would be moving into the house I once gave away. They would never know about the tears I cried in that guest suite or the way the thermostat used to lock me out. They wouldn't know about the woman who had once stood in that kitchen wondering if love was supposed to feel like begging. And that was okay. That house wasn't part of me anymore. The new one, the one with the coral kitchen and the sage walls and the wildflowers in the window, that one was mine. On quiet days, I still walk the riverside path. I still pause by the bench where the tide comes in, soft and sure. Sometimes I bring a thermos of coffee. Sometimes I just bring silence. And when I see other women passing by, heads low, shoulders burdened, I smile, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has lived the questions and survived. There are still moments when I miss the boy Nathan once was. the gap-toothed grin, the science fair volcano. The day he hugged me in public without embarrassment just because he was proud. But the man he became, the man who saw my trust as something to manipulate, who watched his wife rifle through my private life and did nothing, that man is no longer mine to grieve. He made a choice, so I made mine. And to every woman listening, every mother, every grandmother, every soul who gave everything only to be forgotten when it mattered most, I want to leave you with this. You still get to choose the ending. Not them. Not circumstance. Not guilt. You. You are not invisible. You are not too late. You are not defined by the absence of their gratitude. You are defined by every quiet moment you chose to rise anyway. You are the hand that steadied itself when no one reached out. You are the voice that whispered enough when the world tried to silence you. You are the author now. So write something beautiful, because your story doesn't end with being cast aside. It begins with you walking forward, head high, heart soft, and pen in hand. If you've ever poured your heart into someone only to be dismissed, if you've ever felt like love wasn't enough to earn basic respect, then maybe like Eleanor, you understand the quiet strength it takes to walk away without bitterness. Have you ever had to reclaim your peace after being betrayed by the people you loved most? What would you have done in her place? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because every shared story reminds another woman she's not alone. And if this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter in our journey of healing, dignity, and quiet power. Thank you for listening. Your presence here matters more than you know.